Hello, everyone. I'm Erin and I'm the senior editor at Ethos Books, and welcome to the launch of our latest short story collection, How We Live Now, edited by Yume Balasingham Chow. And we are lucky to have Yume here with us all the way from Chicago, and she'll be in conversation with three contributors from the book. We have Anittha Thanabalan, Janine Ko, and Rachel Heng. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have Anita Tanabalan. Anita's debut novel, The Lights That Find Us, was a finalist for the Epigram Books Fiction Prize Award in 2018. Some of her short stories can be found in Mahogany Journal and Best New Singaporean Short Stories, Volume 5. She spends almost all her free time walking Dino, her poodle. And next, we have Janine Ko, who's the author of The Gods Will Hear Us Eventually, published by Ethos Books. Her work can be found in the Iowa Review, Carolina Quarterly, and Kyoto Journal, among others. She teaches creative writing at NUS and is the writer and co-founder of editorial firm Deep Narrative. And then we also have Rachel Heng, who's joining us from the US. Rachel is the author of the novels The Great Reclamation, forthcoming from Riverhead Books, and Suicide Club, which has been translated into 10 languages worldwide. Rachel's short fiction has been published in The New Yorker, Best Small Fictions, Best New Singaporean Short Stories, and elsewhere. And finally, we have Yume Balasingham Chow. Yume is the co-author of Singapore, A Biography, and co-editor of In Transit, an anthology from Singapore on airports and air travel. Her short fiction has received a Pushcart Prize Special Mention and won the Mississippi Review Fiction Prize and been shortlisted for the Sewanee Review Fiction Contest and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. So now I'll pass the time to Yume to begin the session.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Good evening to everybody in Singapore. I'm actually calling in from Boston. Rachel is also on the East Coast, so we are both on 8 a.m. time. If we are a little slow, please forgive us. We will warm up very soon. So thanks for the introduction, and thank you for spending your evening with us to hear about the new anthology. I'm just going to make some kind of opening remarks, think about kind of, I guess, the thinking process behind putting together this anthology, talk for a few minutes about that. So I wanted to start by thanking Ethos for inviting me here and inviting me last year to be the editor. When they were like, do you want to put together an anthology of Singapore short stories? I was like, yes, please. I love reading short stories. I love talking about them. Sure, let me spend 6 months reading as many as I can. And then today, here we are. So this book was about 1 year in the making, which isn't a whole lot of time when you think about it. And together with the editors at Ethos, and I want to give a shout out to Suning and also Erin, who was just introducing us. We read as much as we could of everything that's been published in the last 5 to 10 years, sometimes going back a little further. And we were looking for stories that we hoped would say something thoughtful, interesting about Singapore today, and also that would resonate with young people because this book is going to be used in schools. But when I was reading, at night, in the daytime, on my desk, at my desk, on my couch, in bed, I wasn't thinking things like, oh, is this going to be a good O-level text? I was just thinking like, oh, what's the story doing? Am I curious to find out what happens next? Is it drawing me in? Am I being moved, especially by the end of it? That emotional response. And I think that emotional response is something that's really important when it comes to reading. It's actually kind of what we're instinctively, unthinkingly looking for. And it can also be the thing that can be hard to express to people, like why you love a particular writer so much or why you love a particular book. Because it's like, you have this feeling, something that's kind of beyond words, right? So coming back to the 10 stories in this collection, at the very beginning of the project, before I read anything at all, I wrote down in my notes, short stories are by definition small but capacious. And I think that's what I was really looking for as I was reading and commissioning work for this collection. Small but capacious. People don't often say, in Singapore, even now in Boston, I work in a bookstore, I talk to people, I try and convince them to read more short stories. And they're like, oh, I don't like reading stories, short stories. They are too short. They are over just when you're getting into them. And I'm a big novel reader myself, so I get it, right? You really want to like sink into several hundred pages of an invented world and lose yourself there. But I think the interesting thing about reading short stories, and especially really rich ones, and I think we have 10 really rich stories in this collection, is that each one is almost like a mini novel. It's capacious, it's rich, it's capable of evoking a whole world, sometimes even multiple worlds. And when you have a really solid collection of short stories, I don't think it's something that you actually sit down and read cover to cover. I think it's more like something that you can dip into, when you just want a little something, a little sensation, feel something intensely for a little while. You read for maybe half an hour, you finish one story, and it's like, you're good. You've had this journey, you've been given something to think about. It's all compressed into a very short, dense narrative, and it's kind of enough. Yeah, so those are kind of some of the broader thoughts about stories and what, when you put stories from different writers together in a fresh collection like this, that things that can really make it pop when they're all together for the first time. So yeah, I think what we're going to talk about this morning with Anita, Ginny, Rachel. It feels weird not having a stage to gesture at them. I have to point at their Zoom screen. But this morning, we're going to talk to the three of them about their stories and what makes them capacious, as I was saying. But more broadly, I think talking about all the 10 stories, I think they will, some that really make the most of the potential of what a short story can do. And so in that sense, they are all much bigger than a short story. They kind of expand outwards into like this really complex, fascinating, contradictory Singapore, much bigger than just what the 1 or 2 or 3 characters are talking about. And I just want to talk briefly about 2 of the smaller stories in the collection, by which I mean they are actually the shortest ones. So we have Painting the Tiger by Philip Jeyaretnam, and we have The Thing by Yo Joanne. So I'm going to talk about Painting the Tiger first. It's really about one character. It's someone, he brings his son to the zoo. They look at some tigers. He thinks about tigers, and then the story goes on to like open up this way of reimagining Singapore that's very powerful. And I just want to read you a little excerpt from the story to illustrate what I mean. And in this excerpt, we are with the main character, Ah Leong, as he is literally trying to paint a tiger. So the quote from the story: "But how could someone born and bred in this city paint a tiger from his heart? 600 years ago, the lion had been chosen for us, even though no lion had ever walked our land, as if our destiny as an imperial outpost had already been determined. When a few hundred years later, the British came prowling, sniffing around the islands of the Riau, the lion was a perfect fit for the projection of the British Crown's power. The contrast between the lion, who dominates his pride by force of will, hunts in the day, and overwhelms prey with the strength of an entire pride, and the tiger, who hunts at night, alone, relying on cunning as much as strength, illustrated the difference between Singapore's orderly streets, with the first street lighting and sanitation in Southeast Asia, and the dark jungles all around. Not surprisingly, then, that tigers were ruthlessly exterminated." That's the end of the quote. So most of Philip Jeyaretnam's story is taking place in modern Singapore. And then suddenly, boom, we have this like brief historical excursion, telescoping out to like a point of view about why is Singapore the way now, and then we're back to Ah Leong and his painting after this, right? And we follow him as he's painting. So that's just one example of like, it's a really small story, but like, boom, it takes you to multiple places at once. And then the other story I wanted to briefly mention, also very small but capacious, is called The Thing by Yo Joanne. And we have a father and a son dealing with an absent mother who has simply disappeared without explanation. And the son is a teenager and he starts knitting. And he knits and knits and knits. He's using black wool and he starts knitting this giant thing, which is what the story calls it. And the thing starts getting bigger and bigger and he starts carrying it around. And what is he making? What is he doing? What's going on inside him? The story never actually tells us explicitly, but instead it poses these questions. It makes us think. In particular, it raises these really interesting questions about Singapore society, how people love and care for one another, or how they don't. And as the readers, we are left to draw our own conclusions. So yeah, in my introduction to the anthology, I wrote that all these stories pose questions such as, what are we doing here? How did we get here? And what will we do now? And to be honest, these are questions that have haunted me personally for years. I used to do a lot of research on Singapore history, which gave me some understanding of what took place here on this island in the past and how it came to be this way. But over time, I also became more interested in the question of what are we doing here? Why do we still live like this today? And what makes Singapore, Singapore? So I think in some ways, the 10 stories in this collection offer a tentative answer to that question. None of them is self-consciously about being Singaporean. But when you read them alongside each other, you have this kind of collage view of Singapore culture at this moment in time that emerges. So the kinds of like hidden hopes and fears and dreams and energy, you know, things that are simmering below the surface, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes not. And the stories also show you very unexpected sides of Singapore. They take us to places that we think we know, and then they show us something else. So just to use examples of the stories by the three writers who are here, Anita's story takes place in a wet market, but it is not about shopping for a family dinner, nothing like that. Much more interesting. Rachel's story takes place in a senior citizen's home. And I don't want to spoiler it, but it is full of life and color and a lot going on. Yeah. And then Ginny's story takes place in an HDB setting, which is kind of familiar. In some ways, we've seen it before. But the relationships between her characters, you know, it feels very fresh, and it also deals with serious matters, you know, but it manages to do it without being heavy-handed. So they're all just really interesting journeys into these spaces that, you know, as Singaporeans, we immediately recognize, but then also it's like, hey, something interesting is going on here. Let me turn the page and see what it is. Hopefully you'll have that reaction too. So to quickly recap, you know, the things I am broadly thinking about even today are, you know, do short stories, is this story moving me? Is it rich? Is it capacious? When you reread it, is, you know, is your experience deepening? You know, it's like it gets better when you read it a second and third time. Yeah, those are the kind of big things that I'm often thinking about with regards to short stories. So in closing, for my opening remarks, I just want to acknowledge the other writers I haven't mentioned yet, whose work is in the collection. We have Dave Chua, Karen Kwek, Patrick Sagaram, Jessica Tan, and Yolanda Yu Miao Miao. Yolanda actually writes in Chinese, and we have an English translation of her story by Jeremy Tiang, who recently judged the International Booker Prize. So overall, it's a really wonderful lineup. I hope you read them. I hope you enjoy them. There are some fun roller coaster rides in there. Please, you know, take your time with each story. And now we're going to turn to our three writers, Janine Ko, Anita Thanabalan, and Rachel Heng. Each one of them is going to read a little from their story, and I'm going to ask them a little question about their process and so on. And then we'll have a general chat about writing in short stories, and we'll have time towards the end to take questions also from the audience. So let me hand the time over to Ginny.
Okay, thanks, Yume. So I'm first up. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to read two short sections from my short story. My short story is titled Close to Home. Just a little bit about it. It's about a boy who was sent to live with his neighbor for a period of time because his mother was undergoing cancer treatment. And so the story kind of unfolds about his experience living apart from his family and, you know, trying to make sense of the mom's diagnosis, you know, and building an interesting relationship with his neighbor/nanny for a period of time. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first page of the story. The year my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, my father sent me to live with my neighbor, Auntie Lo. He said he couldn't drive his taxi, ferry my mother to the hospital, and take care of me. It was only temporary until my mother finished her round of chemotherapy, until things settled down. It was 1998. I was 10 and didn't want to live in a stranger's home. Although to be fair, Auntie Lo and her family weren't strangers. We had been living next to each other in the same block of flats in Pasir Ris. the east of Singapore for the past decade and had chatted a few times along the common corridor. Still, I would have protested against my father's wishes, if not for the fact that my mother had become so frail she could no longer get up from bed. Her body, once plump and supple, was now loose and gaunt in her pajamas. I didn't want to add to their troubles. It was perhaps also my mother's wish that I didn't witness how her illness had debilitated her, how she needed to grab the red spittoon beside the bed every few hours to throw up, or how my father had to carry her to the bathroom for her most basic needs. The day I left home, I noticed that the small bald spot on the back of her head, at first a circle no bigger than a 50-cent coin, was now in an even patch the size of my fist. Her eyes were red-rimmed and watery as she waved goodbye, promising that she would bring me back soon. She had begun her second cycle of treatment. So after this, he met his neighbor, I'm going to skip a couple of pages after where he returns home to his family for the first time again. It was odd living in a house next to my parents, yet not being able to see them as I pleased. Since I didn't have the keys to my own home, I would peer outside Auntie Lo's window at the common corridor, hoping to catch a glimpse of my mother. I never did. Thankfully, my father brought me back every Sunday evening, and I would lap up our brief moments like a thirsty dog. My mother often asked if I was adjusting well at Auntie Lo's, if I was eating enough, if I had done my homework. I would talk non-stop, filling the gaps of silence with my mindless chatter, hoping to keep her awake for as long as possible. She grew steadily weaker, dozing off in the middle of our conversations, and each time her eyes closed, I feared they might never open again. The grey bags under them were dark and heavy against her sallow cheeks. Her pasty lips stretched thin each time she tried to smile. Even her eyebrows had fallen away. The first few weeks I visited, she wore a brown woolen hat, which I had never seen before, and would scratch her head every few minutes. One day, after a particularly bad itch, she removed the hat and told me not to be frightened. I said I wasn't, and that was true, although I thought she looked strange, like an alien, a faint blue vein pulsing behind her ear, her bald head smooth as the back of a ladle. Yeah. So those are the two sections.
Thank you very much. That smooth as a ladle line always for me, I'm like, oh, the mom is so sick. Yeah, when I hit that moment. Yeah. So just a quick question about your story. You have a number of very striking female characters. You have the mother, whom you were just reading to us about. We have Auntie Lo that you mentioned at the beginning. And then during the story, we also meet Auntie Lo's daughter, Pei Fen. These really striking women, but you chose to tell the story through the point of view of a 10-year-old boy. And I was wondering why you chose this point of view, why it was important to you, and also maybe why you decided to set the story in 1998. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the first part about why I chose a male protagonist. So this story was inspired by my husband's childhood. Okay, so when he was telling me about his childhood, what happened was that he was actually sent to live with a neighbor who turned out who became his nanny, and he also only returned home during the weekends. And so when he told me that part of his childhood, I was really fascinated in a sense, because I mean, right now we seldom hear of such arrangements. I mean, I'm a parent myself, and I can't actually really imagine doing that. And most of us, we send our kids to like childcares, or and to send them away for like the entire week is really not so common. So that really inspired me to think about what his experience was like, and of course, other parts of the story and all the trouble that came about later on is all fictitious, but but the starting point was actually to hear my husband telling me about his time there. And actually, he was like a baby when they sent him there, and so when he was much older, when he was like a toddler, they brought him back home to live with them, but because that really made me really curious about the experience. So I decided to set the story with a protagonist that was older, like 10 years old, who was able to sort of analyze and observe a little more, and who could be a little bit more active as well, as a character. Yeah, and so that was sort of like what happened, like how this story came about. And I set it in 1998. So this thing about setting stories in the 90s is something that I guess is like very personal to me, because I don't know, it's like a penchant for this nostalgic era that, I grew up in. And, like even my novel, The Gods Will Hear Us eventually is set in the 90s. And that was when I was a child. And, I feel like, they say that, us millennials, we really went through this very short, brief period of time where technology just became like really super fast, and our lives are so changed now compared to just even 20 years ago. The internet and everything changed everything, and there is this little fondness for me myself, to sort of relive the past a little bit, and I can do that through my stories, like the sights, the smells of Singapore, what it was like, before we all addicted to our phones, what did we really do on a day-to-day basis? How did we pass our time? And all those things really fascinate me. And maybe, that kind of sense of nostalgia really brings me back and back again to that period of time that I just want to capture and put it and immortalize them into the pages of a book. Yeah. So that's
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really great and overview of how you came into the story. Also really interesting what you said about time, I think, and maybe we can talk about it later when we do the group Q&A. But just kind of like how writing a story is a way of time travel for you as the writer, because you're trying to bring back this period and what it felt like before we got addicted to our phones. And then also, what the experience might be for the reader, right? When they are transported by your story. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so from a 10-year-old boy, we will go and look at some teenagers. Anittha Thanabalan has a story with two very, if I may say so, vivacious teenagers. So yeah, over to you, Anita.
Hi. Okay, my story is like what you may mention, set in a wet market, which I think a lot of teenagers probably haven't been to, especially recently. So it's about these two best friends who are in a wet market every Sunday, and it's what happens to them one Sunday. So I'm just gonna read the excerpt really quickly. Geeta wandered casually over to the mutton stall. There was a moment's lull, no customers were waiting. She scooted by the smelly deep bin. Then she grabbed Ramani's apron, yanking her down from the high step, and pulled her to the back of the stall. What is wrong with you? Ramani demanded, prying Geeta's fingers off. She tried to stand, but Geeta pulled her back down. They were surrounded by styrofoam box towers. Unless someone wiggled past the bin filled with meat trimmings, it was impossible to see them. I told you to check your phone, and I gave you the 5 signal. What? The 5 signal? We have discussed this before. DEFCON 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Geeta flashed the corresponding number of fingers in Ramani's face. You do know that DEFCON 1 is maximum urgency and DEFCON 5 is minimal urgency, right? But I look stupid jabbing one finger in the air. Do you think you look like a genius, wagging your hand like a tail? Shut up. Geeta took a deep breath. Look, Eileen is here. Who? Eileen Tan? That short girl with the tall friends? Yes. The one that thinks our mother tongue is Indian? Yes. Okay, so? We have to go. She can't see us here. Why not? Because she'll take a story or a picture and post it, and everyone will know what we do on Sundays. So? We promise never to tell anyone what our parents do for a living. We promise never to tell anyone what your parents do for a living. I'm proud of my parents. It's an honest living. Their faces carried the same frustration. Eileen is in the market right now. Even if she doesn't come to my parents' stall, she'll go to Auntie Maizara's, Auntie Ling's. She'll see you. She'll see what you're wearing. Ramani stood up. A long grey rubber apron hung to the tops of red knee-high rubber boots worn over leggings. When she moved, the apron rubbed loudly against the boots, like a toddler's squeaky shoes. I call this wet market chic. They're not even the same color. Please don't go, okay? Geeta stayed crouched and squeezed her hands together. Eileen knows we're friends. I'll be dragged into it with you. Ramani glared at Geeta. Dragged into what? I'm helping your family as a favor to you. And now you want me to abandon them so that you can save face from a girl who can't even tell us apart? Geeta's eyes went wide. Oh my God, she's going to think you're me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The snappy dialogue in that story is those two girls, young women, very alive. So your story also has an interesting behind the scenes origin story of its own, because just for the benefit of the audience, I read an earlier version where Geeta and Ramani were involved in something else, slightly supernatural, family heirloom, this and that. And then I asked Anita, would you like to expand this story? Tell us more about the relationship between these two, because it's so hard, I think, to write well about friendship and adolescent friendship. And that was something, in the earlier story that was simmering. Yeah. So yeah, maybe if you could tell us how you decided to, go from the earlier version to this one. And also the elements that you brought in. I mean, you just kind of showed us in your excerpt this classmate who can't tell students apart because they're all the same, which is ridiculous, right? And there's sort of concerns about like, oh, their parents are hawkers at the market, and what will their friends think? Yeah.
So the earlier version that you may mention was more of a parable. So she wanted me to explore the friendship, which I actually really honestly enjoyed. It's kind of opposite to Ginny, because Ginny wanted to go very nostalgic and go back to the 90s. I also grew up during the 90s, but I always wonder about teenagers today, because I feel like all the access to all these tools that they have now, like Instagram Live is a great example. Like the idea that at any moment, if I want to share something about a friend, I can just pick up my phone and just go live. And like there will be, I mean, not like, if you're not an influencer, I understand there'll be like smaller amounts, but it's still an insane concept to me. So the story is live at the wet market. So one of the characters, Eileen, she eventually goes on Instagram Live, and she shows what happens. But that's always very fascinating to me, because it's like you can't really escape from, as you get older. I'm so happy that I didn't really have all this growing up, because there'll be so much stupidity of myself just online and forever online, and at least I don't have to deal with that. So I wondered how teenagers would grow up with all this and like I'd be unable to escape from it. So that's what the story really captures, and the friendship element as well, with all of this that exists around you, because ultimately I feel that obviously there's a lot of friendship and like just teenage adolescent lessons that don't change, but technology is a very interesting addition into all of that, and technology that you can stream from anywhere is insane. So I just wanted to explore what that would look like and how that will ultimately affect friendships.
I'm trying to think of how I can speak about your story without giving things away. But yeah, it has like all these very of the moment elements. But some of it, like you said, teenagers being insecure in some ways with their relationships in school, or the dynamics. Like we all recognize that, even though like I'm older than the two of you and I remember what school used to be like. Yeah.
I also wanted to look at like parents, I guess more because the parents are wet market vendors essentially. They all sell meat or flowers. I wanted to look at that dynamic as well. Like imagine having those conditions, and then now you have technology, which I know is not often considered, but on a very like basic level, how does that affect your day-to-day life? So yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so we'll turn next to Rachel, who's going to read us a little bit from her story.
Hey everyone, hi. And as you may kindly point out earlier, we are on 8 a.m. time. So forgive me if I sound asleep, but I'm awake now, I have coffee. Anyway, okay, so I'm gonna read from my story, Before the Valley. The candles were already lit when Hui Bin arrived. Her mistake. She'd missed the announcement at breakfast saying today's party would take place in the big hall instead of the rec room. What was wrong with the rec room, she mentally complained while taking her place in the crowd. Birthday celebrations were always in the rec room. But catching a glimpse of pot-bellied Kirpal in his wheelchair, Hui Bin softened. Likely the change had been made because Kirpal was so popular and more residents than usual were expected to attend. Typically, birthdays were local affairs. Hui Bin was in Ward 4, one of the 14 bed wards, which was a bad thing every day of the year except for her birthday, when it meant that she could count on at least 13 other people showing up to her birthday. A relief, since Hui Bin had never been good at making friends, even before. Before was a shorthand residents used for their lives prior to Sunrise Valley. Before wasn't talked about often. It felt unseemly somehow, self-indulgent to dwell on one's past life. What did it matter, for example, that Cynthia from Ward 8 had been an actress who starred in horror films they used to make back here in the 60s, or that Hazmi from Ward 12 had been a lawyer and was even rumored to have owned his own firm? They were all here now, Sunrise Valley residents, one and the same. Sure, Cynthia was in a two-bedder with a garden view, and Hasmi had one of the few coveted and very expensive single wards. They still had to come to the linoleum-tiled dining room each morning for the same soggy kaya toast and watered-down coffee. Still took their seats each evening in front of the television, which blared alternately English, Chinese, Malay, Tamil language soaps. Wards aside, were the residents not all in the same boat? The details might differ: mild dementia, children too busy to visit, loss of leg function, no living relatives, but the crux of the matter was the same. You were stuck in Sunrise Valley regardless, whether it was paid for by your dwindling pension, the government, or an erstwhile child. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That selection you picked gives us like a portrait of the Sunrise Valley residents. Yeah, really vividly. Yeah, and your story is so interesting because it takes place in a space that we don't often see described in, I think, in English literature in general, like basically a home for like, senior citizens, older people who are not allowed to live on their own or maybe can't, depending on the circumstances. And then in an earlier story, Vegetarian, you also wrote about a character in a similar situation, right? Similar setting, not situation. Yeah. Yeah. And I was just curious, like what drew you to write about this space? Where did the characters come from in a way? Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that story earlier, because the earlier story, Vegetarian, because when I wrote this, my husband said, oh, you're just writing the same story again. But I maintain that they're different. They have similar characters, similar themes, but a similar setting, but I think they're different stories. And I think what draws me to them is, I think we write towards what we fear, or or sense of loss, or something that we're trying to recover, which is something I feel like both of the other writers have mentioned as well when they were answering your questions. And I think for me, that thing that I fear, that I think about, or where writing comes from for me, is this fear of death, and kind of mortality, right, and loss. And so I think a lot about what it would be like to be this age. And obviously I haven't lived through it. And I've witnessed, older relatives and not so old relatives like pass, unfortunately, and sort of reckoning with that and thinking about the strangeness of time and like life in that period before that death or illness is imminent, and like what do you choose to do with your time, and what do you, I don't know, and like what are the relationships that remain, or what are the conflicts that still remain, and how very often we are still inextricably ourselves in that moment. Like we don't become better people, or we don't like suddenly become, even if when we know that we don't have much time left, we can't fix all of the dysfunction that's happened in our lives. Like those relationships still stay fraught, and then you try, and then it's like even more poignant or frustrating. And maybe you have like one moment of grace, but in general, life is as it always has been, and then it ends. All right. So I think, sorry, this is like real downer an answer. But I think that's sort of where I get to when I write these stories. But I do return to it again and again, because maybe it is a fear of my own. It's kind of an obsession of my own.
It's a really honest answer. I appreciate, and also a lot to think about. Yeah, like what are we writing towards? Not necessarily writing about, but towards, right? Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. Let us, maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes, I'm going to just throw, a question out, and any of the writers can respond in any order, it doesn't have to be. And also if you want to pick up any threads from what each other were talking about. Yeah, I think sort of maybe bridging from what Rachel was just saying, each of you is writing characters who are not like you. They're significantly older or younger than you, as you all were saying. It's so much is imagined, right? So much is you trying to feel that thing. And I guess, what is your trick, or what is your way of making these details about Singapore life so vivid and real, since you are not living any of these particular lives? Because I think when people often ask me, how did you think of that? I don't know, I don't know. It came to me. So now I will put you all three on the spot instead to answer this question. Like, yeah, how do you inhabit these worlds of people who are not like you? Anyone?
I think for me, like for my particular story, I mean, they're Indian girls. I was an Indian girl, so it wasn't particularly difficult. But I do think that like when it comes to writing, I guess writing stories a lot, it's always fun to try and empathize like really as much as I can. I think empathy is really important for writers in general, people in general, of course, but yeah, especially for writers. So I try very hard to think about myself in the same situation and how I would react. So that also helps try to figure out like their voice and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think I draw a lot from my own personal experience. Sometimes they say that there are certain writers, some who like to write speculative fiction. I'm not saying that speculative fiction doesn't have, the same kind of observations of a human life. But, for my own stories, I tend to veer towards the more realistic kind of stories, like things that are very, I would say, day-to-day slices of life, real, and that sort of thing. And so I draw from a lot of my own personal experiences and observations, and the people around me. And, I like what Anita mentioned about how we need a lot of empathy, when we approach our characters, so, whether we're writing about a young boy or is it an old lady, in a nursing home, or we're writing about a father or mother, I think, like Anita, I also try my best to just really be in their shoes. And at the end of the day, I think my compass is always that, we're just writing about the human condition, and, whoever you are, it goes back to that whole idea of the human condition, and what happens when we are put into a particular situation, or our characters are stressed in a particular way, and how we respond would differ, but again, we are all humans, and there are certain similarities that tie us together, when I think about it in that framework framework or paradigm. Okay.
I think for me, it often comes back to the physical and like what it's like to be in that character's body. And obviously I can't know if I'm writing a character who's, I don't know what it's like to be 80 years old and in a senior citizen's home, but sort of trying to really situate yourself, like to think about the senses and like what it feels like, like on the skin, or like what does it feel like to stand up, or like to look at something, or what food you want to eat, or and sort of those, even if those details don't go in necessarily, the way that they situate you in that character's point of view always helps for me. And then I think this is an exercise that I sometimes assign to students when I'm teaching on characterization, which is when you write a character, to give them one characteristic that you absolutely don't have, like give them an opinion that you absolutely don't share, the opposite of your opinion, and then to give them one thing that you do share, like have them love something that you love deeply. And that's sort of a way of like getting into a character and empathizing, but also getting out and like having them expand beyond yourself. So I try to do that sometimes when I'm stuck as well.
Thank you. Interesting you mentioned that, because I'm writing a novel, and a lot of the time I'm thinking about that very character thing about like, oh, this part I agree, this part I don't, I'm totally not like the character I'm writing about. But it's kind of like a good compass to tell you, like, you don't veer too far off, but you also want to give the character its own life. Like they get to be their own, full creation, not just one thing. Yeah. I'm actually going to jump to one of the questions in the chat that someone has posted, because it's a good bridge again. So the question is from Anonymous, and it says, how do you devise dialogue? Do you think of the characters first and what they would say? How do you lend them an authentic voice? So I think an authentic voice might be something we can also talk about, like what constitutes authenticity in fiction on the page, right? But yeah, just to repeat the question, how do you devise dialogue? Do you think of the characters first and what they would say? How do you lend them an authentic voice? All of you have dialogue in your stories, so I was like, oh, this is the perfect thing to ask right now about talking about characters. Yeah. Anyone? It's okay, you can think first,
Okay. I'll just break the ice. I think with dialogue, I think that's always really difficult. I remember, like, I used to watch a lot of like a masterclass online, the site. So I bought the one that Neil Gaiman did, because it's Neil Gaiman. So I remember he said that if you want to do dialogue, you got to listen to your character, So I thought it was very interesting because it's like, I never thought about that before. So usually I try to put words in their mouth. So that was something that like always stuck with me. When I was writing this particular story and everything else I'm working on when it comes to dialogue, I always read it out loud and then I try to respond to myself. I find that really helps because no one really talks like how they write. Like when you write something, you don't talk like that. No one does. So I try to do that with my characters. I find that it's really helpful, and it makes it more authentic, I suppose. Like it's not you drop certain vowels, you drop certain words. You will not say, "I had gone to the market yesterday." Like that's never going to happen. So it's just things like that. So I try to be very mindful of that. I think when it comes to authentic voices, that's a really like big question because it also links to like who. I know there's this whole thing happening online of like who should be able to write authentic voices and stuff like that. But I really think it comes down to empathy again. Like if you do a bit of research and if you have sensitivity readers and all these things, I think you can write almost anyone. And also people that maybe you also don't entirely relate with or you don't really share the same life experiences. And it does help a little bit to just see what's out there, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think this is a really interesting question from the audience because I find that dialogue is actually a really difficult thing to write. And I feel like most people actually struggle a lot with it. I mean, when I teach my students, I also tell them that, dialogue is actually one of the most difficult skill to acquire, or at least that's how I feel, because I will tell them that if you're not careful, all your characters will sound the same and they're going to sound like you. Because, when we are writing our characters, we write it in our head. And like what Anita shared, how she'll read it out loud. And that's really one of the ways, it's almost like a litmus test to see whether are your characters all sounding the same. And personally, for me, the way I avoid that is to, again, I try to read out loud the story as well. And I think what really helps me is to often just, I wouldn't use the word eavesdrop, but when I'm outside, when I'm around people, I try to kind of hear how they speak and how they talk. And this is something I learned when I was doing my master's in creative writing as well. Like I really like what my teacher taught me, which is that always listen to what people are saying and the way they are talking, because no one sounds the same, whether you're sitting in a fast food place or the hawker center or the restaurant, or getting your order taken or what, just hear the different voices. And I think after a while, you sort of form this invisible catalog in your mind, when you want to pull out a certain character. It's a little stereotypical. So that's another thing to be careful about, you kind of stereotype different people, the way they speak. But that's where, editing comes in, as you edit, you sort of hone them and, model them into a different person. But yeah, to me, that would be a good starting point.
I would also say I totally own up to the fact that I eavesdrop all the time. I'm not shy about it. It doesn't mean I'm going to use what I hear, but I am like that
exactly. We're not exposing
yeah.
people's secrets everywhere, but we're just observing our environment.
And it's what you say about the feel, right? Because like when we're writing at home individually, it's like us and the computer, or and the voices of the characters, but we can't test it out by be like, hey, you come and play the character, I test on you, can't do it, right? We're kind of creating that from nothing. But then when you observe people in real life having a conversation, you can see all these 2-way, 3-way dynamics going on that are fascinating. Yeah. Okay, I was just, no one is ever going to have a secret conversation around me again. Anyway, okay, Rachel, sorry, if you want to add anything.
I was just say that was actually an exercise a creative writing teacher assigned me once, which was to go out, well, not just me, like not me specifically, but our whole class, to go out and to like eavesdrop on conversations and then just like write down exactly what they say, like verbatim. Because then you realize like, oh, it's strange. Like people, exactly as Anita was saying, like people talk like how you don't think they talk, or like in your head they talk a certain way, and then if you actually listen to what they're saying, like it's very different. Like the way that they like interrupt themselves or like each other, or they don't listen to each other, or like the subtext of what they're saying and the ways in which like they're trying to get something or like appear a certain way, or I don't know. Yeah, it's very fascinating. So I think that would be sort of, I don't do it anymore. I should actually, now that I'm talking about this to everyone. And it's funny that when you asked the dialogue question, everyone was silent. We were like, oh, I don't know, man. Like dialogue's just terrible. We don't want to. But I think, that's probably how I should do it and how I would give advice on how to do dialogue, just like to listen to people and take notes.
And I guess like half the time we're just winging it.
Okay, But winging it is the best also, because that's how you find new like serendipitous solutions to your whatever is going on the page. I was just going to pick up and say, because Rachel talks about this creative writing exercise and how people talk. We talk in circles and repeat ourselves. And also this distinction between like how people really talk, if you were going to record them, and then what appears on the page. Because actually, if you put too many of these repetitions and so on the page, the reader might feel, I already know, I read this half a page ago. Why is the writer repeating, making the character repeat? This is not good dialogue, because the reader might get impatient, right? And so coming back to the question about what's authentic voice, also, like, I think this question of realism, and that in fiction, not necessarily you're always trying to replicate realism, but evoke it. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there for thought, if anyone wants to respond. Yeah, because the second part of the question was about authentic voice, and yeah.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what you said, about how we're not supposed to replicate it, verbatim of what people say, right? But we're supposed to sort of process what they say and rewrite it so that it sounds succinct enough, yet it sounds realistic. Yeah, and I think that goes back to editing, like the entire conversation may be like 15 minutes, or so, but on the page, we're only allowed like 30 seconds to 45 seconds, of writing it on a page for the readers to read, and it should encompass everything of what a 15-minute conversation should hold, so yeah, to me it goes back to editing.
Okay, anyone else want to respond? I don't want to cut off other. No. Okay, I think, yeah, and I think the fresh thought that I just had right now as I was listening to Janine talk also is about what is authentic. What makes a character authentic is that we, the reader, believe this character would really say that or feel that, as opposed to a specific phrase or something. It's more like, no, we get it. You're speaking from the heart. You're really angry right now. Or you're really happy right now. And that's exactly what you would say. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that level of like aesthetic authenticity, I might say, as opposed to sort of some cultural or whatever it is that we sometimes get hung up on. And that's going to lead me to my next question, which is my own. Well, there are some more chat questions in the Slido, which I'll get to in a bit. But I had a question for again, related to dialogue, but more than that, not just dialogue, writing about Singapore, and the fact that people who are not familiar with Singapore might read your story and may not be familiar with a wet market or with certain Singlish phrases, for instance. And whether this is something you even think about. I think there is a lot of unnecessary hand-wringing, as I call it, about, people won't understand Singlish if you put it in stories. I'm like, no, I disagree vehemently. But open to the panelists, like, yeah, do you think about how your story will be read outside Singapore? Do you think about how much Singlish to put in? Do you think about how you describe a place and who you're describing it for? Those kinds of questions, just throwing it out there for you all to respond to.
I can say something since I'm not in Singapore, and maybe you can jump in as well. I think when you are, especially if you're writing about Singapore and you're not in Singapore, and most of your colleagues or readers around you are not Singaporean, like it's something that you are always navigating, and something that I'm very, I don't know, I guess I hand wring to myself about it, where I'm like, you veer between being like, oh, will they understand it on one hand, on the other hand, like, why am I explaining it to anyone, and why do I need to explain it to anyone, or like, who am I writing towards, or like, am I getting too much in my head because it's like these people who don't know this who are writing, so it's affecting my writing, and I'm writing in a way that I wouldn't normally write because I'm writing towards like someone who doesn't understand it, and then like the existential crises that follow. And so I think I just try not to think about it and try to think about like writing for my first readers who are usually very close friends, most of whom are Singaporean or who are very familiar with Singapore. And then I think, for things like Singlish or like, would they understand, would they not understand? I'm like, if we don't write it, they won't understand it. Like if we never write it, then no one will ever understand it. So I feel like if it feels right for the story. At the same time, I don't want to be like, oh, everyone has to write Singlish so that it is authentic, because it's not, right? And if we're writing English anyway, like we're not writing in like Singlish or like, I don't know what would be like the most like capital A authentic Singaporean story? Would it be like an entire story in which the narrator is also speaking English, which people have done like beautifully as well, but at the same time not to preclude everything else, right? So I guess I think if it feels right for the story, and for your like ideal reader, whoever that is, and for me it's often someone who is like a close friend like me, or someone I grew up with, or someone like the people whom I want to be reading my stories, I try and like write towards them, and be okay with the fact that there are people who aren't going to understand it, or there are going to be people who are, you know, on the flip side, think that I'm explaining too much, right? Or I'm saying too much, I'm making too many concessions to like a reader who doesn't know this setting. But just to kind of make my peace with that and like do the best I can.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the other panelists.
Yeah, I guess like this thing that, you know, Yumi was talking about, you know, being concerned whether people will understand our culture, our language. This actually weighed heavily on my mind when I was a younger writer. You know, like for instance, when I was doing my master's program in LA, I had to write like stories for the workshop and all that. And I was very self-conscious that, you know, these people would not, my friends or my teachers would not understand what I was writing. And so my first couple of stories, I actually set everything in the West. You know, I had like you know, white people as my characters. They all had, you know, white names and they were doing white things. You know, I don't know. Yeah, so the thing is that it didn't turn out very well. You know, I personally, I mean, not that we cannot write, you know, characters in the West again, but you know, personally there was this like barrier that I couldn't access because because I was, you know, just really self-conscious, and I felt I had to fit in. You know, whatever I write, there's this layer that I felt that I have to write in a way that they would understand my story, and it came out artificial for me. Yeah, you know, and I could, when I read it, I knew it, and still I submitted it. And then I think it was only in the second month or so I decided to just, you know, whatever, I'll just try, you know, and then just set one story with a Singaporean character inside. And then I was really surprised that everyone enjoyed it and they understood it, you know, and then I got bolder and then I decided to write an entire story completely in Singlish from a first person's voice, you know, and they could understand that as well. And I was like, oh, the only thing that's stopping myself is me, you know, and you know, it's all this like, you know, fears, you know, or insecurities, or the feeling that, you know, you have to write what people want or understand. And so yeah, I think that was a great lesson for me, you know, that I can write my stories that I'm familiar with, I can write characters that I'm familiar with. And you know, again, back to the idea of the human condition, as long as we are talking about people, you know, suffering and things like common themes, you know, you will be understood. And I think over time, as I read more of this, and people who also write, you know, about their own culture, and they do not over explain in their stories, like, you know, Juno Diaz and all that. Yeah, and then you realize that, oh, okay, you know, it is possible. Yeah, and that really gave me the confidence to do it. Yeah.
Anita, do you want to add anything or?
I think I just want to say that I really like resonate with what Jeannie said. I grew up, I mean, I think we all grew up reading a lot of like white authors typically. I didn't really read my first non-white author until quite late in life. I think the first one was The God of Small Things. The writer suddenly just left my brain. I don't know. And then there was a lot of like Anita Desai stuff that I read as well, and other.
Arundhati Roy, right?
Yes,
The God of
thank
Small
you.
Things.
Yes, Arundhati Roy. So when I was starting off writing, like also a lot like Ginny, I kept writing white characters, and I had this like fake British accent in my head that I had to put on paper, and it was ridiculous. And I think ultimately like that process was really helpful for me because I realized that it's so not authentic. It's so the opposite of authentic, and I sounded insane. So I think trying to write like proper, like as in like just write yourself or just represent yourself on page is also very liberating. And it's really nice. Like sometimes now I teach English lit tuition, and when I see like some of my students reading stories with Singaporean characters or like different ethnic groups, different like people with different disabilities, so on, all these things, it's so nice because it's not just one person, one ethnic group on page anymore, and that is always really great. And also like when we were growing up reading books by white authors, we never wondered about like their practices, as in it didn't bother us, it didn't stop us from reading the book. Like Judy Blume used to write a lot about the landscape of America, I never wondered what Walgreens was. It never bothered me. Like, I just knew that, oh, it must be a supermarket or some sort of shop. So I don't think like writing about Sheng Chong, for example, is going to bother anybody. So yeah.
Yeah,
Plus,
you
Sheng
think
Xiang has that beautiful musicality. Sorry. Yeah.
oh, sorry.
Rachel, yeah, go ahead. I was being flippant. Rachel, go
Say
ahead
like
with the series.
you read like 19th century books or like 18, like right in school you have to read Shakespeare and like we can understand that context. So like yeah, Sheng Xiang should not be that.
And I totally get what Anita meant when she said that, you know, when we write at the start, it was like all this British accent in our head, or American accent, and our characters are speaking that way. You're like, what is this? Who is this?
Yeah, that also made me think about the writer Marlon James, who won the Booker a few years ago. And in some of the interviews that he's given, he talks about how when he was starting out as a younger writer, and he had this voice, like kind of like what Ginny and Anita were saying, like you think you have to write with that proper British, perfect diction, everything, you know, certain kind of syntax and all. And it was just constraining him and he was not writing well. And then when he kind of was able, he talks about this at length. Like if you just look for some of his interviews, he talks about it. And once he shook that off, like Anita was saying, it's liberating. Suddenly it's like, oh, I can speak with my voice and my voice wants to tell these stories. And then, you know, his writing became more powerful. And I think that's also like a really important thing for us to like sometimes remind ourselves when we're feeling a little bit like cornered or like, nobody understands me, or but to just have faith that your own voice might actually be enough for it. I was going to jump. There was another question in the Slido from Yolanda, who's one of our contributors, who asked, how do you deal with dialect versus a local or international readership? And I mean, just to kind of bring it together in the context of what we were just talking about, Singlish and other cultural elements. I mean, part of it is like people can look things up themselves, maybe. Part of it might be, maybe, it depends on how pivotal I think the emotional point is. I often think about that when I'm in my own writing or like reading someone else's story, which might come to me from a different world that I'm not familiar with, you know, writers from parts of the world I've never even visited. And just like, oh, this word, I can tell it means something important. I don't know exactly what it is, but I can tell that in this argument, this is the deal breaker. And from how the characters react, it's good enough. I don't need to actually consult a dictionary, even though I could, because I'm feeling it. So I have to come back to that. The writing is already moving me. It's not that one word per se. Maybe if you spoke that language or you were from that culture, that word would zing to you a little more and you have like extra layers of perception, right? But not all of us need that all the time when we're reading. We don't have to understand. I think that's one thing also that I sort of try to remind myself, like my readers don't have to understand everything in the story. They just need to understand enough for that emotional movement. And it's okay to have some gaps because they can sometimes fill in some of the gaps themselves, and it's feelings. It's not like it's not like a test where you need to understand all these things about Singapore to get any story. Yeah, so just kind of being comfortable with some space, I think, for your reader to fill in themselves, or just like not know and be okay because they've got so much else to work with in your story. Yeah, that sometimes is useful too. We have a couple more minutes at the time. All right. Yeah. Well, I'll jump to another question this is from a different anonymous. And the question is, how do you find inspiration and stay motivated when writing about Singapore, a place that seems mundane yet so familiar to us? So the mundane and familiar question. I don't know if any of you have thought about this or, yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, Singapore does feel very boring, especially if you have lived there your entire life, like I have. And it's very small and all these things. But I think that people in general are very interesting. Like if you really tap into someone's opinions and like the way they look at things and their perspectives and what shapes them, like you could really write that for a long time. Because it's so interesting to see what shapes someone. And even though the landscape doesn't change, the person always does. And we all take different things from this country and our perception of it, and the values, the societal values and the individual values based on the societal values. Do they accept it? Do they not? I'm sorry, my dog just sneezed. I hope I didn't hear that. Different things happen. So I think that is what makes it very interesting, because people always surprise you. Yeah.
The human condition, as Jenny was saying earlier.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess for me, I actually don't feel like Singapore is very mundane. In fact, on the contrary, like I feel like because we progressed so quickly in the last, few decades, that there's actually so much to sort of, mine from the population in a sense, like in terms of if you talk about like character building, it may feel like on a day-to-day basis, we all seem to be pursuing the same things, and maybe that's the kind of dryness and mundaneness that when people talk about Singaporeans, like there's no variation, maybe in what we think is the good life, to be in Singapore. But I feel like because of this progress, in the last few decades, there are so many different groups of people that we can observe, and write about, the kind of who are left behind in this pursuit of progress, who have moved forward, people who have moved forward, what are their lives like, and so on and so forth. So I actually never felt like Singapore was really very mundane for writing. So it's actually, there's actually a lot of things that we can be inspired by, or at least for me, we can be inspired by.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think Singapore is mundane at all. I think it is very strange and fascinating, and very interesting. And I would hazard a guess that the person who sent that comment, there are probably parts of Singapore that you also realize are interesting or weird or fascinating that you don't think about. And the sort of like, oh, Singapore is very boring. It's sort of a throwaway thing that people say, or I think we're all used to saying that. I don't know why. I feel like I grew up hearing it, and like I thought that too when I was young, and maybe it comes from like being a teenager and being like, oh my god, where am I gonna go again? Like, am I gonna go to Wisma Atria like one more time? Like that feeling. But like moving past that feeling and just thinking about like the things in your life that like, yeah, people have fascinating lives in Singapore. And I think just specifically finding what is interesting to you. Like it doesn't have to be interesting capital I, like interesting to everyone, but I feel like everyone has their little like obsessions, or like I don't know, or they're like people who, or even or you look for characters or like people who are passionate about things, like people who are like really into. The other day I was reading, there was this guy in like, I think he lives in like Upper Thomson or something, and he has like a collection of fossils. Has anyone heard of this? There's like a Singapore fossil collecting Facebook group. They're like these people, so they're like all of these little things that, and there are people who are like really passionate about that one thing that they do. And so I think, yeah, it's just very, especially in like such a dense place where there are like just so many people and like so much stuff happening, and then all of that history that's like concentrated in one place. And so, yeah, maybe this is not a very helpful answer from any of us, because we're all like, it's not mundane.
Yep, maybe that is precisely it, like the eyes that you bring to the scene in front of you, right? And I often think of it also in terms of attention. Like obviously, if you're going about your daily life, wherever you live, you cannot pay attention to everything at once, because you need to get your life done. You need to take the bus, or you need to go to work, or whatever it is. But I think for me also, like when I started writing more fiction as opposed to nonfiction, I was starting to pay attention differently. I noticed that in myself, because I would be sitting at a bus stop watching my neighborhood, and I would notice different things that I would not, from what I would notice in the past, and it would be like, oh, I wonder why that person is wearing that outfit, and how would you even begin to put it together, and what do they do the rest of the time? And just wondering, not that I wrote about that person, but wondering who are these people, moving around us, or even like looking at an HDB landscape to be like, oh yeah, it's all the same. It's the knee-jerk reaction. But if you actually sat and looked and paid attention to different parts, and then brought that attention to bear, like that, I feel like in any landscape, you could be in a desert, you could be living in what seems to be a flat, monochrome desert, and if you pay attention, you would find things that were sort of grabbing your attention at the corners. And sometimes I think, going back to maybe Jenny was saying earlier about Singapore being high-tech, fast-paced, that it's easy to not pay attention because there's so much going on, and it's almost like we have to deliberately own self slow down a little bit to be like, oh wait, hang on, I want to linger here for a minute because I really like looking at that thing, or observing that person, or eavesdropping on that conversation. How many times have I stayed extra long at a table to be like, I'm staying here till this conversation is done, not taking notes and just listening until they leave. Like, okay, now my turn, I'll go. But making time for those little interactions. At least that's my reaction.
I also say like that sameness itself is interesting, right? It's yeah, like what you're talking about, like, oh, the issue are all the same. I'm like, that's like the beginning of a story to me already. I'm like, ooh, like, why is it all the same? Or like, what happens in that sameness? And then the other thing is like going back to what Anita and Janine were saying about like writing white characters or like white stories. And I think that instinct of like, oh, there are no stories to be told here, like in Singapore, like that's mundane, you know, is that idea of like what stories are worth telling, right? And like, what must a story have? Like, what is the setting in which a story is worth telling? Like, does it have to be like, oh, in New York City, where it's like, then that's like exciting, or like that's interesting, right? And then we have this instinct that because you just haven't read that many stories like told in this like supposedly mundane place, maybe, but then it's sort of up to you to like make it interesting, right? Or to like bring that attention to it and like say like, hey, I'm going to tell this story about this supposedly really mundane thing and like make it worthwhile, and then people will read it, and then hopefully, you know, 10 years later no one will say that Singapore's mundane anymore because you've changed that narrative.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That is also a really good point. Changing the narrative, I think, which perhaps leads to this other question from YKit. If you had the chance to extend your story, what would you have liked to include more of and why? If anything, yeah. And also I would build on that to say, like Rachel just built this point, I made this point about changing the narrative and what types of stories. And I guess, you know, beyond your story that's in this collection, what other things interest you that you haven't yet written about, maybe? While the panelists are thinking, I will hazard a short reply to YKit's question about the chance of extending a story. I also write short stories. I'm working on a novel. And for me, my short stories, I have never wanted to extend a single one of them because I felt like for me as a writer, I had come up with these imaginary characters, given them some stuff to work out. They'd done it within usually 6,000 words, sometimes less, rarely. And then I was like, you know, I'm good. Like I've sorted that out for them. Feels right. It's the right size. Yeah, done. Like ding, finished. So that's plus. I know not every writer works like this, but I'm just saying, like for me, I've always like, to me, a short story in my head is very different from my novel, which can grow and grow and grow, and at some point you're like, too many words. It's a different feeling. I guess perhaps a different interest level. Like for me, when I write a short story, I just want to know that moment in that character's life. I don't actually want to know. I know what that backstory is, but I don't need to write it out on the page. Whereas with a novel, I think I'm like, oh wait, this is a bigger question. These are 3 or 4 or more strange dynamics between characters. I need more space to write it. Yeah. So that's just me. Throwing open to the panel.
Yeah, I would say same from, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you want to go ahead first? Sorry. I agree with you, May. I think when you start writing, or when you're a writer in general, it's more, you don't finish a lot of your stories. I start a lot and I don't finish a lot. Like they're just like half written in my computer and they're like just waiting for me to continue, just dangling on the cliff. So it's so nice to finish a story, especially a short story, that I would never want to extend their life. I'm like, okay, you're done, bye. That is how I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. If a story works for me, then I don't want to extend it. And then if I want to extend it, that means it's not working. So I guess then maybe either it becomes a novel or I do not finish it, as Anita says.
Yeah, so I agree with Anita and Rachel and Yumi as well that I thought it was a very fascinating question actually, because I have never ever thought of extending any of my short stories. I almost feel like short stories are a different animal from like novels. You know, like novels, you can have like a second part 2 or part 3, but for my short stories, yeah, I mean, no matter how much I like a particular character in the story, I just never thought of extending its life, you know, to put him in another scenario. It's like whatever it has happened in that episode, I'm really happy with it, and yeah, and satisfied, you know, with the trajectory of that person's life, you know. And I think especially for short stories, the ending is, we usually put a lot of thought into the ending. Like it has to end in a certain way that is impactful, you know. And so when we are happy with that end, we or at least for me, I seldom think of extending it. Like what Rachel said, if I have to extend it, there might have been something wrong with my ending, you know, that requires that.
Okay. Great. Does anyone want to respond to this idea of changing the narrative and stories that you haven't written or you hope someone will write? Things that will make Singapore not seem mundane at all.
I don't know about changing the narrative. I feel like anything that anyone writes from any perspective will be adding or changing the narrative in general. Because like everybody has just different ways of doing things. So yeah, I think it does happen eventually if you keep writing and you're not afraid to put out ideas that feel odd or different. Yeah.
I think for me, it's not so much of changing the narrative as to adding more diversity in the voices, which I feel like it's been happening in the recent years with the explosion of Singlit and everything. So I feel like we are in the right direction, you know, Singlit as a whole, as a community and as a community of writers. So I feel like, yeah, it's not so much about changing it, but building on it, you know, with more diversification.
Great. Okay. Let me just, okay, we've covered everything that came from the audience. I have a couple more questions, but I just want to see, okay. Well, maybe we will wind down then. And let me ask the last question, which I have stolen from a podcast I enjoy called the Ezra Klein Show, where at the end of his interviews, he always asks questions about books of his interviewees. So my question to the panelists are, what is one book that has shaped your thinking about fiction writing? And what is one book of any genre that you wish more people would read?
So for me as a, oh, you want to go ahead? Okay, for me as a really young writer, I think I was really impacted when I read Yun Li's short stories. Yeah, I think the one that I really like, I have it down here, is 1,000 Years of Good Prayers. You know, and I think what really fascinated me was her treatment of the characters. They were really I wouldn't say oddballs, but they were like really fascinating. She has like an old lady, and then she has this, and then she had this like story about like a fake emperor and stuff like that. So I think she really opened my eyes, you know, to good storytelling. Yeah, and I think the one book that I wish more people would read, which actually I do think that many people have already read, or at least those in the writer's circle, would be Miranda July's stories. Yeah, you know, she has a short story collection, No One Belongs Here More Than You. And her characters are super quirky. They really force me to think outside of the box, you know, like, you know, what the kind of quirks or strangeness that a person can embody. And speaking of that, I would like to say the second book, even though your question is like one book, but, you know, I really like Amy Bender's short stories as well, more than her novels actually, but, you know, her short stories, hers would be, I would call it like almost like fabulist kind of fiction, you know, and her characters are like really crazy, like, you know, there's a boy with like an iron head, you know, like an iron forehead, you know, and like, you know, like they like all these really interesting quirky things that really just I guess it really is different from my style of writing. And also when I read it, I feel like it expands my own style as well. I may not adopt everything that they do, or like I may not even write speculative fiction, but just being exposed to that, I think changes me as a writer as well.
I think I know you may actually send us this question beforehand, and I kept putting off figuring out the answer to it. But I would say two. I was going to say for the first one, what affects my fiction writing. And now that Jenny's answered it, I was like, oh, I should have thought of fiction. That would have been better. But I kept thinking of like craft books. I thought that was what the question was, which clearly makes more sense the other way around. But there are two that have affected me a lot. I think one is it's a book by Lawrence Wexler, I don't know how you say his name, but he wrote a biography about the visual artist Robert Irwin, who's this guy who was working in like the 50s and 60s and like making these, like I'd never heard of him before I read this book, but he was making these, and he's very famous, but I never heard of him. So he's making these like big light sculptures and things, but it's a biography. So he interviews him, and it's just this whole book where he's like, it's a series of interviews, and he's talking about like his practice and his life. And it's just a really interesting book about creativity. And he would talk about like how he would like go to the studio and sit there and just like think, and like what that thinking process was like. And I was like, I remember when I first started writing fiction, and I was sort of trying to go at it on my own, and I hadn't like taken classes yet. And what went on in my head was very much like, what do people actually do when they like sit down? Like when you look at, you know, the word down, like what are people doing? I wish I could like just sit behind someone and watch how they made sentences, or like how their thought process worked, right? So I think that was something that like really frustrated me in the beginning, because people would like workshop, but it's like when you workshop, you bring the piece to class. So I'm like, oh, but now I'm seeing the finished thing. I don't know how you made that. Like, how did you do it? What went through your head? And then how do you revise stuff? People talk about like revision. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, do you like go sentence by sentence? Like, are you like when you're thinking, what's happening in your brain? So I think that was like something that I struggled with a lot in the beginning. And when I read this book, and just like a heads up, it doesn't actually answer the question that I'm asking. So, you know, people are like, oh wow, you should go read that book, then I'll know what people think. I still don't know, but but it's just a really fascinating look at like how an artist like goes from having nothing to having something. So I love that book, and it's called Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees by Lawrence Wexler. And then specifically for fiction, one that I read recently that I loved was Body Work by Melissa Phoebos. And she's an essayist, and her other book, Girlhood, which is a series of essays about like being an adolescent girl and like sort of the like sexualization of like young girls and like going through that and how that was like traumatic process, is like really, really good as well. So that was released, I think, last year, and then Body Work was released this year, and that's a book on craft. And she's a professor of creative writing who teaches sort of memoir and personal essays, and it's quite a revolutionary craft book, I think, because she basically talks about how like writing, like there's this perspective that like writing about the self, or like autobiographical writing, or like memoir, is sort of frivolous and like self-indulgent, and like, you know, kind of it, and the implication being that it's less worthy, right? It's not like literature. And she makes the argument that it is, and like that is the most urgent form of literature, and that is what people have done throughout history. And like, you know, various like, I don't know, like sexism or like racism, whatever, everything has sort of conspired to make us think that like this is not important. And so she's written this like craft book that's like very much about craft, and like how do you write fiction, or how do you write essays, while also staying true to that like autobiographical urge out of which writing comes for most people, like, you know, from the very beginning. And I think it's like, one, just a really beautifully written book, and two, like very wise, and I loved it. So that's Body Work by Melissa Phoebos. And then, the second question of what I think people should be reading, especially specifically to a Singaporean audience, I think people should be reading Singapore, a Biography by Yume over here, and Mark Frost, her co-author. It's an amazing book. It's really, really good. I read it in like 2017, when I was researching my second novel, which was sort of about land reclamation. And I was like, oh my God, I want to understand like all this history, like what's a good Singapore history book? And I randomly Googled it, and I randomly found it, and it was like fascinating, because there was all of this stuff that I just like didn't know about Singapore. And again, back to the question of like, is Singapore mundane? If you read Singapore Biography, you will know that Singapore is not mundane. It's like really just like really strange and like convoluted and interesting, you know, with like drama filled. Yeah, it's great. And it covers, I don't know, you may will know this better than I do, but like, since I think it starts in like the 1300s and goes to the 1960s or 70s. And I go back to it again and again, honestly. Like, I'm not just saying this because Yume is the host. Like, I literally have it on my desk right now for like another project that I'm working on. And if you think that, even if you're writing in contemporary Singapore, I think it's a really good book to read, because it helps you understand like how we got here to that question of like how we live now. And there's all of this stuff that I thought was just like, this is just like, I accept it, this is the way that we live, or like this is just how Singapore is. And then you read the history and you're like, no, this happened like it came out of a very specific like historical moment, like colonialism, or like, you know, modernism, or like, I don't know, or just like I don't know, the way in which like our relationship with like China, like all of this stuff that's like really fascinating and interesting. So yeah, the book that I wholeheartedly think everybody should read is Singapore Biography by Yume and Mark Frost.
Thank you. I didn't expect that. I think that means you probably read the book a lot more recently than I have. because I haven't reread it since we wrote it.
I read it this morning again. No, yesterday.
Thank you. Okay. Anita.
I think for myself, a book that really helped me think about writing a bit more like craft wise, I guess, was Shirley Jackson's most recent short story collection. The kids found a bunch of stories she didn't publish, and then they published. I think it's called Just an Ordinary Day, and it is a whole story. Like her short story collections are really cool because some of them just one page, some of them go on for like. So she wrote different stories and then different endings in the book. So there'll be like two of the same stories. It's not the exact same way, same premise, and it ends very differently. I thought that was really interesting because you don't really get to see that. Most writers, I think, they shove that into their bins or into their computer. So that was really cool. I genuinely love her work because she's so creepy, and it's kind of great to see a woman be so like unabashedly creepy. It's fantastic. Yeah, and I think a book from my childhood that I read that really shaped me was the Crestomancy series. I don't know if everyone really knows this. It's the Diana White Jones series. No. So that really helped as well because it just gave me license to like think differently and just be as imaginative as you want, and there's so many people who read it anyway. Yeah. And as for like what to read and sing it, I think Rachel has really sold Yumi's book to me. I'm really gonna check it out because it sounds so interesting. And another book that everyone can pick up is
Thank you. Yes, I haven't seen my physical copy yet, so I'm very excited. You should do more. Yeah, it hasn't reached me here yet, but yeah, more show and tell. That's the book, people. Yeah, I cannot wait to see it myself. Hold it in my hands the way you all are doing it. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Lots of food for thought about writing and about books to read. I think we will wrap up now. We are about at time. Thank you all out in the audience for giving us your time and attention. Thank you to our panelists for your great answers and expanding the conversation as always. This is great. And thank you to Ethos for holding the whole thing. Let me hand it back to Erin.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation and for all your readings. I hope everyone enjoyed this special night. So we've come to the end of the launch of How We Live Now. If you'd like to purchase a copy of How We Live Now, you can get it on our web store at ethosbooks.com.sg or from local bookstores, Kinokuniya, Epigram bookstores, Grassroots Book Room, and Littered with Books. And as mentioned, this is a O-level text, so for teachers who are interested to learn more about adopting this book or resources for teaching short stories in the classroom, you can visit the education page on our website to sign up for our mailing list or get in touch with us. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.